do you see that map okay on your screen? Okay, great. So over here between the tribe of Dan and Judah, we have quite close to the border. It's in Dan, this area of Zorah. Samson comes from between Zorah and Eshtal. And so this is basically the region we're going to be looking at. Just below it, we have the area where the Philistines lived. So you see Gath, it was Goliath's home. There is Ashkelon. So some of the events are going to take place in that area, but I'll go ahead and take that back down and put my notes up. I just wanted you to get our bearings as far as where we'll be looking tonight. All right, so how about this now? The notes, you see those okay? All right, let me adjust them on my screen a little. And last time we looked at some of these lesser known judges, Tola and Jair, and then we concluded with Jephthah. So we're ready to move on to Samson's story. So chapters 13 through 16 tell us the story of Samson, and certainly a colorful individual. His life is going to be a life of contrasts. He had his good times, and he certainly had his lowest bad times. Blessings and cursings, and a time of great strength, and yet great weakness. There's going to be a warning for us. He was born into the truth. It was all he ever knew. And many of us have been around the body of Christ, the church of God, God's calling for decades. And if we disregard what we've been given, kind of like Samson did, then we can turn down a very bleak path. But finally, at the end, it turned out to be a lot better for him, even though it was the event that led to his death. So in chapter 13, excuse me, I've got to make another adjustment here on my screen. Okay, that's much better. That'll let me see the scriptures on the side here, and also then be able to look at the notes with you. So with Judges chapter 13, we here are introduced to the family of Samson, the ones who would bear Samson, and gives us the amazing events that led to his the conception and the birth of Samson. But here it says in verse 1 that this was another period of time. We've noticed many times already there are these cycles of sin where that leads to oppression, and then when the pain level gets to a certain point, they cry out to God, profess repentance, and then God lifts up a deliverer in different areas in the country. But this time they were delivered into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. So the Philistines are going to be around in Israelite history for quite some time. King Saul, King David, they had a lot of troubles with them as well. But in verse 2, a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites, his name was Manoah. So Manoah means rest. And God, through this family, was intending to bring a certain rest, and there would be a rest period of 20 years during Samson's judgeship. His wife was barren and had no children. So I think a lot of this story we'll just summarize, because I think we're probably more familiar in the book of Judges with Samson's story than we are with many of the other areas we've looked at already. Manoah's wife has the angel of the Lord appear to her, and she tells him that she's going to have a child. So in verse 3, You'll conceive and bear a son. But notice in verse 4, please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. So this was God's plan. This was God's purpose in the fact that Manoah and wife would bear a son into the world. Now, in verse 5, the beginning of rolling back the oppression, Samson, as we'll see his name later, but his name means sunlight or like the sun. The Jewish historian Josephus, in his retelling of this story, mentioned that the name meant a strong or daring one, and he certainly was going to be that. In Numbers chapter 6, it mentioned here he would be a Nazarite. So I think it would be good to review Numbers 6 verses 2 through 8 is where it speaks about the vow of a Nazarite. And again, just some of the highlights here, that in most cases a person would decide for themselves, they would decide they wanted to devote themselves and take a vow before God. In Samson's case, it was something that he was born with. So it tells us basically 3 restrictions. He will eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, from the seed to the skin. So no wine, no vinegar, no grape juice, no fresh grapes or raisins. And then secondly, he shall let the locks of the hair of his head grow. And thirdly, he shall not go near a dead body. Now, we're going to see all 3 of these play a part in the story of Samson. We aren't told that he was consuming wine, but he did partake in some of these feasts that would go for a full week. And generally, they were times of a lot of adult beverages flowing. And if you go to a feast of 7 days, one of those days was going to be the weekly Sabbath, but Samson was off partaking in the celebration. His hair, of course, grows throughout his life until the time when he allows, or when he gives his secret to Delilah, and it is cut off. And then he shall not go near a dead body, and he shall not make himself unclean. Now, touching unclean animals could make a person unclean as well. And we'll see the story where the young lion came out and he killed the lion with his hands. And then later on, in going by, finds the bees that had moved into that carcass, and he goes and grabs some of the honey and goes off and gives some to his parents, and he's eating it as he goes. So a lot of these particular points of a Nazarite's vow, he is going to be having a very cavalier attitude toward them, being very careless with them. So he was in this special sanctified relationship from birth. You may remember John the Baptist, some of these same things. He too appeared to have been under a Nazarite's vow. So again, I think that the bulk of this we're familiar with. The angel of the Lord appears to Manoah's wife, and then of course she tells her husband. He wants to hear it straight from the angel, and so that happens, and the plan is given to Manoah as well. Let's look at the end of the chapter. I think that's really all we need to summarize from this chapter. And in verse 24, so the woman bore a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Mahanadan. Now that just means in the Hebrew, the camp of Dan. So this was the area where the tribe of Dan was assigned, between Zorah and Eshtaol. So the Spirit of the Lord is going to move with him, work upon him in a very unique way than the way God had worked in others' lives. So we'll go to chapter 14, and this brings us to the story of Samson wanting a wife. And we begin to see certain things in Samson, certain character flaws. But as I have in the notes here, Samson could be likened to a young person who grew up in the church and it was all they ever knew. And yet he also is obviously one who's going to have to learn things, a lot of things the hard way. There's an easy way, and that is from learning from God's instruction or learning from others' mistakes. But Samson was one where it seems like he was going to have to make the mistakes himself. And he was just not all that convicted, it appears, that the way his parents had taught him, the way they lived, was necessarily the way he wanted to choose in life. So in the early verses here, verse 1, he sees a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Well, this is odd already, because the Philistines are the ones oppressing the nation of Israel, and particularly those tribes neighboring Dan and Judah. And so he wants to marry into the people who are oppressing them. And notice in verse 2, he tells his father and mother, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as a wife. Seems an odd way of putting it. He's telling his parents, I want what I see, and I want you to go get her for me. Verse 3, then his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she pleases me well. Well, it's also good to notice in verse 4, but his father and mother did not know it was of the Lord. So God is working here behind the scenes. God is orchestrating what takes place. That he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So God's working out, setting the stage, preparing the events so that a deliverance can be given with a bit more time. So in verse 6 or verse 5, it tells us that as they are going down to Timnah, a young lion came roaring against him. Samson at that time was by himself. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. He tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. I think many of us have probably seen the old movie, Samson and Delilah, who was Victor Mature, played Samson, and I think it was Hedy Lamarr played Delilah. But it has that part where this lion attacks him, and he just tears it apart, kills it. Okay, so verse 7, they went down, talked with a woman, and she pleased Samson well. Then they're traveling back after some time. When he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. So again, as a Nazirite, don't touch dead bodies. Don't touch unclean. And here's an unclean animal that's been dead quite some time. So he took some of it, the honey, in his hands and went along eating. He came to his father and mother. He gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. Now, this event is going to play in with his riddle with the friends there at the wedding later on. Okay, verse 10. So his father went down, and Samson gave a feast there, for the young men used to do so. And it happened when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. So sounds like quite the celebration, quite the party. And so he tells them a riddle. So again, he's one who just seemed like he had to live on the edge. And here he is tempting fate. And of course, he tells the riddle, verse 14, out of the eater, that obviously is a lion, came something to eat, the honey. Out of the strong came something sweet. So then, of course, there was a wager of clothing and linen garments, and they couldn't explain it. Verse 15. Verse 15, it came to pass on the seventh day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? Well, they are practicing extortion with her, and yet, sadly, as the story unfolds, the threat to burn the family's house and the family with fire is actually what happened to them. Verse 16, she wept, you don't love me, you hate me. He finally tells her the answer. At the end of verse 17, she explained the riddle to the sons of her people, and they came out with the answer. What's sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion? And so he said, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon. All right, that's one of the 5 main cities of the Philistines, and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So some strange things are taking place here in this story. But he killed 30 people. This is the first 30 of many, many people he's going to kill with his own hands. So moving on, well, before we leave there, I do have in the notes there, Proverbs 16, verse 32. Proverbs 16, verse 32, it says, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Samson had unbelievable physical strength that came from God, but it's far better to have self-control than it is to have all the strength in the world. Okay, so chapter 15, we have the Philistines are not happy. Verse 1, after a while, the time of wheat harvest. So this would be approaching the time of Pentecost, although it's not mentioned here. It happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat, and he said, let me go into my wife, into her room, but her father would not permit her to go. Verse 2, the father said, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her, therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead. Well, that leads to Samson somehow catching, he must have been fast too, catching 300 foxes, it says. He took torches, verse 4, turned the fox's tail to tail, put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines. So wheat When it is time for harvest, it is extremely flammable. The shocks, the standing grain, the vineyards, the olive groves were burned. So obviously, verse 16, the Philistines asked, "Who has done this?" And they answered, "Samson, son-in-law of the Timnite." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. So the thing that the 30 or that the friends had threatened is now carried out after the burning of their crops. And verse 7, verse 7, Samson said, "Since you would do a thing like this, I will take revenge on you. After that, I will cease." Verse 8, so he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Etam. So verse 9, the Philistines went in and camped in Judah and deployed themselves against Lehi. The men of Judah, again, remember, we're right on the border. So you've got Dan and Judah being involved in this story. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They answered, that's the Philistines answered the men of Judah, "We have come to arrest Samson to do to him what he has done to us." Well, that's kind of the attitude by which Samson lived. You know, they do it to me, I'll do it to them, only harder. Verse 11, 3,000 men of Judah went to Samson. "Do you know the Philistines rule over us? What is this you've done to us?" He said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." So they arrested him. He allowed that. They took an oath that they would not kill him themselves, the Jews. And so he was bound in 2 new ropes, brought up from the hideout. They came to where the Philistines were camped at Lehi. Verse 14, the Philistines came shouting against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. So it's like he is clothed with this tremendous physical strength from time to time as it's needed. The ropes were like flax, and that had been burned and broke loose. Verse 15, he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand, took it, killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, so he's also quite the riddler as well. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men. So again, we have insight into a man who seems to have practice in wreaking havoc. He was devious. He was cocky and self-assured, and he had the attitude that I can do anything. I can handle anything. So he's overconfident in himself. He is not looking to God for his strength. He was physically strong, but spiritually very weak. So the spirit of retaliation, of striking back, leads a person down a very dark path. As the story winds up here in the latter verses, through the jawbone, a place called Ramoth Lehi. That means jawbone height. So I guess that's as good of a name as anything. And he was very thirsty, and this time he cried out to God. But it was because his life was in danger and because he wanted something. So God split the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out. He drank. His spirit returned. He revived, and he called its name En Hakori, and that means spring of the caller. That's where he cried out to God. He judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So there's an awful lot of story that took place in Samson's life that we just aren't told. We're given some of the highlights. Well, now we come to chapter 16, and this is going to be his last. It's uh, it's a sad story in many ways. We find a man who does not have self-control. I suppose he's more like middle-aged now, if this is as if it would be after he had been the judge for 20 years. But we continue to find a man who has a flagrant disregard for God's law. And we also find sin or lust, in this case, is ruling over Samson. So in verse 1, Samson went to Gaza. All right, that's another one of the royal cities of the Philistines, and saw a harlot there and went into her. So once again, remember the Levite was not to touch anything unclean, and for those of the tribes of Israel, the Philistines were among the peoples that were to have been unclean to them at that time. So the Gazites were told, Samson has come here. They surrounded the place, lay in wait for him all night. They decided to wait till it's daylight. We'll kill him. Verse 3, Samson lay low till midnight. Then he arose, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two gate posts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. So he ends up carrying lock, stock, and barrel, the posts, the hinges, the gates, and goes a considerable distance away. Well, he's kind of rubbing their noses in it by what he does. But in verse 4, we shift to the story of Delilah. And she is to be the one force that he had no control over. He had lust for her he could not control, and it leads to his destruction. Verse 4, Valley of Sorek, woman whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, so we may bind him to afflict him. And every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So we don't know how many lords of the Philistines are there, but that sounds like a phenomenal amount of money. But their hatred ran pretty high for Samson. So in verse 6, she begins this cat and mouse game with him. Please tell me where your great strength lies and with what you may be bound to afflict you. So verse 7, he tells her about being bound with 7 fresh bowstrings, and he'll be weak like any man. Well, then, you would think somewhere along the line that any of us would realize, this person is plotting to kill me. I better get out of here. But it seems it never entered Samson's mind. It was a game. He was playing games. So she bound him up with the bowstrings and called for the Philistines, and he rose up and broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Then in verse 10, she is persistent. And you have mocked me, told me lies. So she pleads with him again. So verse 11, if you bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I shall become weak and be like any other man. And so once again, she binds him up with new ropes, calls the Philistines, and Samson leaps up and tears the ropes as he had done in the earlier chapter of the story, and broke the ropes like they were threads. And she again persists in verse 13. Until now you've mocked me. So tell me your answer. And so he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom. So it's hard to know how long his hair would have been, but apparently it was formed into 7 locks. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and called for the Philistines, and he awakened and pulled his hair out, and so verse 15, she said, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me 3 times." But notice verse 16. And it came to pass when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him, so that his soul was vexed to death. She just wore him out. The word here for vexed is impatient to the point of death. He told her all his heart. He said to her, "No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." So verse 18, then Delilah saw that he had told her his heart. She went and went to the Philistines once again, and she lulled him off to sleep. Verse 19, called a man, he shaved off the 7 locks, and then she began to torment him. She was pestering him, and then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awakened out of his slumber and found that his hair was gone and his strength was gone. The end of verse 20, but he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. So then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes, brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. So here is a man who had lived by human eyesight, physical eyesight. He had done what seemed right in his own eyes. He had walked by human eyesight. He certainly did not walk by faith in his God. As Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Now, the amazing thing is that he's going to lose, he has now lost his eyesight. And as the events unfold, we're going to have a different man, a man who will cry out to God, a man who has no physical eyesight, and he is going to walk by faith, finally. The King James uses the name Samson 39 times. 38 of those times are in chapters 13 through 16. And then there's one more time. It's in the New Testament. Hebrews 11, just in passing, mentions Samson. Time would not allow me to tell of Jephthah and Samson. I don't know, mentions 3 or 4 others. He lost his sight, but when he began grinding, he began to believe in God and began to walk by faith. So back to chapter 16, verse 22, the hair of his head began to grow. Now, in verse 23, we have the story of the kings of the Philistines gathering together to offer sacrifice to Dagon. That was the fish god, their chief god. And they decided to bring Samson out for their entertainment and for his humiliation. But I should go back over here to the notes. Verse 22, the sign of being devoted to God began to grow again. Now, we aren't given all the details. We don't know how long this may have gone on, that he was grinding grain. But he grew to become a man of faith, a pillar of faith, while he was in prison. He came to the great experience of life. He repented. The story of the prodigal son, the King James says, he came unto himself. So Samson went through that process. He now is in a position where God can use him for the very reason that he was born, and that is for God to begin to lift off the oppression of the Philistines from the tribes of Israel. So he finally is willing to do it God's way rather than his own way. But you know, the strength never did come from the hair. It never did. It came from being devoted to God and God's purpose for his life. The strength began to flow again because he was a changed man. And as Zechariah the prophet wrote, it's not by might or power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. So the story unfolds. They bring Samson out. He is to perform for them. Verse 27, the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed. So we aren't told exactly what it was that he was called to do, but they were getting their jollies out of seeing this enemy of theirs suffer. But verse 28, then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple. He braced himself against them, one on his right, the other on his left. Then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might. And the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And then, so his life ends, but he ends doing the work that God had for him. He was walking by faith, and God used him as a tool to give deliverance. Verse 31, his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. So his father had died somewhere along the line. He had judged Israel 20 years. So that's where we'll stop, but I do have a number of lessons I'd like to share with you. Next time we'll look at these latter chapters, a couple of instances, stories that just tell us the horrible state of affairs within the tribes of Israel at that time. So 5 lessons from Samson's life. Number 1 is seek the best that life offers. And I probably should have said the best that God offers. Seek the best that God offers. Don't settle for less than the very best. Repeatedly in Samson's story, we find a man who settled for just the crumbs of what could have been. And, you know, we're all guilty of the same thing. We get in God's way. We drag our heels. We sometimes set that jaw and we resist to the working of God. And sometimes we too, like Samson, turn down the path of sin, and it limits the ability that God has to give us the very best, because sin has a way of enticing us and promising to deliver pleasures that it can't deliver. True happiness is only found within the parameters of the law of God. But like Samson, every mistake that we make robs us of something that God intended for us. However, with God's help, like Samson, anyone can recover from mistakes. Sometimes, though, there are penalties and prices that continue for the rest of life. We just aren't given enough to know how it was broken down, the 20 years of Samson. We don't know how many years at the end he could have been grinding grain, but he made plenty of mistakes. He lost his vision, was taken captive, and he paid a price the rest of his life. A second lesson is deeply appreciate God's truth. Deeply appreciate God's truth. Samson had it handed to him onto a platter. You know, he was born into it, and things were easy for him. But his life shows over and over. He took what he had there among the tribes of Israel for granted. But humanly, we all go through times when we tend to disregard or disrespect what God has given to us. We disregard that which costs us little. But the relationship that we have with God and with Christ cost the life of Jesus Christ, and that should bring about the deepest reverence and appreciation for that. When we were first called, we were filled with zeal, and the challenge for us is to maintain that zeal, keep that zeal alive. When I was a teenager and our family started attending church, we were driving 50 miles one way to church, and then they got a different haul and we were driving 70 miles one way to church. But there were people who were there every Sabbath who had driven 150 and more miles to get there. That goes back in the 60s. And there were members in Birmingham back in the 60s that there wasn't a church there, and they would drive all the way to Memphis, Tennessee. And that was a long trip, and that was not the interstate highway that is there now. That was on old US 78, and it was a very slow trip. But they were there week in and week out. So the challenge we have is to maintain the excitement, the deepest appreciation for the truth that God has given to us. And, it's just a matter of fact that once God invests his truth in us, there's not a guarantee that we'll retain it unless we are zealously working to hang on to what we've been given and to retain what we have and continue growing and adding more to it. Okay, a third lesson. True strength comes from God. As I said earlier, the strength for Samson was never in the hair. It was in being devoted to the purpose of God. True strength comes from God. We must never rely on our own strength. Samson died from the cave-in because his mistakes, the mistakes of his entire life, came crashing down on him. But the source of our strength is not within, it's from God, it's from above. But the Spirit of God worked in Samson in a very unusual way in giving him this superior physical strength and brawn. But he learned he couldn't walk by human sight. He learned to walk by faith in God. And again, as Paul used the phrase, out of weakness, we can be made strong. All right, number 4. It is never too late to start over. And in following Samson's story, it looks very bleak whenever Delilah calls someone to cut off his hair and he's taken captive and his eyes are gouged out. But it's never too late to start over. And after he lost his eyesight is when he did his greatest service for God. So it's not how we begin that matters the most, but how we end our Christian race. Samson had it given to him, but he disregarded it and failed failed to see the pearl of great price right in front of him. He paid a horrible price. But in the end, his life ended. He was a humbled, devoted, repentant tool in the hands of God. And in the end, he did what God wanted him to do. So some of us, we've been born into the truth. Our parents were called first, or we've got a lot of decades under our belt. But then there are times we have to learn things the hard way. You've probably seen a plaque on the wall different places, and maybe you have one that says, "Be patient with me. God is not through with me yet." And God truly is not through with any of us. At times we pay a lot of prices by the mistakes we made. But no matter what our sin is, like Isaiah 1 verse 18 says, though your sins be as scarlet, they'll be as white as snow. So it's never too late to turn it around and just start taking steps in the right direction and live the way God would have you live. We can be forgiven and get a new beginning, a new start. Okay, then finally, number 5, judge righteous judgment. Now, I add this because we humans like to judge other people. The Bible counsels us to judge ourselves, and we will not be judged. But we tend to look across at others and make all of these judgment calls. Now, we have Judges 13 through 16 as the story of Samson. And if you were the one hiring judges and deliverers for ancient Israel, and you were given that as his resume, would you have hired him? Well, we probably would have just thought, well, phooey with him, forget him. But the fact of the matter is that God used him, and God continued to work through him, and God used him to the very end. You'll remember the story when Israel went to Samuel, and they wanted a king to be like the world around them. And Samuel God tells him to go to the house of Jesse. And all of these sons are standing up, 7 of them, and then later found out there's an 8th one. He looked at Eliab, the oldest one, and he thought, well, surely the Lord's anointed stands here. But God told him, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Eliab was not taken, the other brothers, and then it was mentioned the youngest one is out tending the flocks. And then David came, and he was the one that God said, this man has a heart like mine. So we tend to look at the externals of life, and it's a sad commentary on how many times we make judgments and we write people off. And the challenge is to, with an open mind, look at someone and strive to look at them as God looks at them, and realize that there is potential in every life. The challenge is to look beyond short-term problems that might be apparent and look to the long-term potential as a child of God that each individual has. So maybe if we would suspend our unrighteous judgments more than we do, we might like each other more and we might get along better. But seems like as long as we breathe for a living, we're going to have stress and strife and problems between people. But God's called us to learn and to improve and to get along. So the story of Samson tells us there's a better way than the hard way. There's an easier way to learn than by the school of hard knocks. Samson made a lot of tragic, sad mistakes. And the story reads to me like as though he led a lonely, frustrated, heartbroken, unhappy life. But in the end, he died a different man. So let us be cautioned by the mistakes he made, and let us take great hope from his example. And we make mistakes, but never forget it's never too late to change and start moving forward. So if you ever doubt that, just look at what God did through Samson. He died as a true superman because finally at the end he walked by faith in God. And that is something that should inspire us all. Okay, that will end this Bible study. Next time we have Micah's idolatry. We have the Danites adopting this Micah's idolatry, and then we have the awful, terrible story of the Levite and his concubine, and then how the tribe of Benjamin was just almost snuffed out. So we have the book ends with those two stories that are just heartrending and heartbreaking. But again, remember, this is a period of time between the leadership of Joshua and when Israel went to the time of the kings. And as it says, the last verse of the book, it was a time when every man did what was right in his own eyes, and it was just a very, very sad time. But when we get to the time of the kings, there was a time of promise, hopefully, but we find many, many mistakes there as well. So